Hey everyone, it's Steve at the Forbes Family Farm, and Emily and I are just, as we're getting into a new season, thinking through the types of content and videos that we'd like to share with you guys. And one of the things that came to mind was just some more videos that share a little bit about how we garden and how we grow produce, and some tips and tricks that you can apply, whether you're just a hobby gardener in a small home, or whether you're gardening and farming at a larger scale. And so today we're going to start kind of at the basics with the idea of bed prep, or prepping our gardens in order to plant into. And we're in one of our tunnels right now, mid-spring, so we have a lot of crops that are already going. And what we have is a few beds that we just cropped out. So we had kale and arugula growing in them. We just harvested those crops entirely out and removed the plant debris. And now we're going to prep these beds to transplant beans into. And so the concept of bed prep, what we practice, is not necessarily anything revolutionary. It's something that we've learned from J.M. Fortier and his Market Gardener's Masterclass primarily. And he's built a lot of what he does off of the work of Elliot Coleman. And there's been farmers and gardeners who have been practicing these similar concepts for decades and decades and decades. And so nothing is necessarily revolutionary, but it's just applying the principles in a way that works within our context. And that's really the challenge for everyone, is finding a way to apply some basic principles in their own context. And so the main principles that we go through in our bed prep are, we really try to minimize our disturbance to the soil, and we'll kind of show you a little bit about what we do with that, and then adding proper amendments for the crops that are going to be growing in the bed, and really preparing the bed in terms of the amount of amendment that we're adding, and creating a nice surface that's weed free and ready for either plants to be transplanted into or to be seeded directly into. And so the first step in that for us is to use a broad fork, and that's what this tool is right next to me, and I'll show you how we use it. The great thing about a broad fork is it's a way for us to basically loosen and aerate the soil without turning it over. Anytime you turn over soil, you break up soil aggregation, and you break up the habitat that exists for microorganisms and bugs that are living in the soil. And all of those microorganisms and bugs and fungi are what are creating the habitat and the nutrient-rich environment for your plants to grow. And so, to as much of an extent as possible, we always try to avoid turning the soil over in any of our beds. And what that means is we're always building on top. We're adding layers to the soil and maintaining that habitat that exists. And the broad fork, what it does is, we've got tines on it. You can find broad forks with anywhere from about 9-inch to 12-inch tines on them. They go down into the ground, and then as we pull back, it lifts the soil just a little bit, again allowing some oxygen and air into the soil, and breaking up any compaction that exists, without actually turning it over and totally destroying that aggregation that's creating a subsoil environment for bugs and microorganisms. And so I'll go along and show you kind of what broad forking looks like, and then the next steps that we go from there. So with the broad fork, this is about the only time we ever stand on our beds or walk across them at all. That's another key trick to avoid compaction, is we always are walking on our paths and stepping over beds. But broad forking is the one time we get on the bed, just so that we can press the broad fork down into the bed and then pull back. And on beds that are well established with healthy soils, it's a very easy, it's not a lot of energy put into this process. You're simply stepping. Occasionally you notice a rock that you might hit, but the key trick is stepping in, pulling back, just to loosen the soil, and then moving about 9 inches to a foot down the bed. And I prefer to work backwards. I think that's a lot easier than trying to go forward with it. And so just going down the bed, it takes just a few minutes. And again, we are loosening and aerating the soil without turning it over, and also without having really heavy equipment on it that would be compacting it. So that's the way that the broad fork works. And we'll do this bed and then show you the next steps of adding our amendments and getting it ready to plant in. Alright, so now that we've broad forked the bed, our next step is to start adding amendments and preparing it for the next plants that are coming in. And before I jump to that though, to address one thing about the broad forks, I don't want to make it seem like the broad fork is a magic tool that will solve everything in terms of building soil. If you try to take a broad fork out and put it into some compacted soil or some grass area that you're trying to reclaim as a garden, you're not going to have a lot of success with it. You're going to wear yourself out, and you're not going to really have much effect on the soil. It's obviously a manual process, and so the ground's got to be soft. The soil's got to be well aggregated with really soft soil, several inches deep, in order for the broad fork to be effective. But that said, I also don't want you to have that temptation to just get out there with a tiller and till up whatever piece of land you're trying to garden in. Tilling is really detrimental to our soil health, and one of the reasons why is it gives kind of this quick fix. We go out, and whether we're doing it by hand and we're double digging, we used to read about double digging beds, and when we were early on in gardening, we were going out and double digging our beds and turning the soil over. And I know a lot of people have tillers, the walk behind type or ride on tillers, different types, and it feels so satisfying to turn that earth over and look at it and say, wow, look how moist that is, and that's perfect for growing in. The problem is we're getting a really quick, instantaneous feeling of success that is just going to be totally reversed in about a week when that whole space is desiccated and starts becoming compacted. And the way to think about it is what holds moisture in the soil is the aggregation that occurs and the life that occurs within the soil. That's what's creating an environment to be able to hold moisture. And when we turn the soil over, we're exposing all of that to the two most desiccating forces in nature. That's sunlight and wind. And so we take what's really moist and perhaps pretty healthy soil, we turn it up and we expose it to the sun and a little bit of wind, and all of a sudden that just becomes dried, crumbly dust with no life in it anymore, because we've destroyed the habitat for those bugs, microorganisms, and the aggregates that hold the moisture. And now we're fighting an uphill battle the rest of the season trying to get our soil to hold moisture. And so instead of, if you're trying to claim some bad ground in order to garden in, whether it's because it's been in grass or it's just really compacted, it's had a lot of traffic on it, whatever your case may be, before you go into that temptation of tilling, think first about how you can build soil, so mulch and build on top of it, and you'll be amazed at how quickly that can start to really deepen the soil without ever having to turn it over. And that's what we've experienced here. Many of these beds I couldn't broad fork when a year and a half ago when we were first building them. The ground was so hard, there was so much rock, you could not even get the tip of the broad fork in. But we started really adding a lot of compost, a lot of organic matter, and now we have very healthy looking soils that we can dig down quite deep a lot of times, a foot plus, and still be finding worms and life that's occurring. And so that's just a tip on the broad fork, as well as related to tilling and why we use the broad fork instead of tilling and turning these beds over. It's also not to totally condemn tilling. That we have seen some farmers and we know people who use tillers for different purposes, and there are some circumstances where maybe it makes sense, or you have a specific purpose that you're trying to achieve. But in most cases, if you're thinking that, man, I wish I just need to get out there and till it, turn that soil over, think first about ways that you can manage whatever problem you're trying to solve by adding more mulch or more material on top. And so that's kind of the next step in our bed prep, is to start adding amendments. The first amendments we add after we've broad forked the bed and we've got most of the plant material off of the bed. There's a little bit, some leaves we had kale and arugula in here, so there's a few little things, plant debris left here, and that's fine. We got all of the roots and anything that would cause it to regrow back in the bed in a way that we don't want it to. But the rest of this is organic matter that'll break down, that'll feed the microorganisms and bugs that we want to be existing in the soil. So our next step is to add amendments that add nutrition, kind of nutritional value for the plants, but even more importantly, they are a feed source for the microorganisms that will then make nutrients available to the plants we're putting in the ground. And so we use two amendments primarily. One is alfalfa meal, and it goes on almost every bed that we prepare. We have a hard time getting alfalfa meal here in the part of the world that we're in, and so we also will sometimes, what we have right now is alfalfa pellets. So they're the small feed pellets, but they're pure alfalfa. There's nothing else added to them, and we will use those, and then we'll water so that they kind of expand and start breaking down before we layer on top of them. So we'll just spread those kind of a handful at a time along the bed. We're not going to do it on this bed, but we also use feather meal. And then on occasion with certain crops, we'll use some mineral mixes and different things, some things like kelp meal and that we can add in that will add additional nutrients that perhaps specific crops need. In this case with beans going in, alfalfa meal is all we will add, and then we'll come back in and put some compost on top. So again, it's a real easy process. We just take it by the handful, and there's no measured amount necessarily. We're just trying to provide kind of a decent coverage down the whole entire bed, with the purpose of this alfalfa meal, or in this case the alfalfa pellets, really serving as a feed source for the worms and all of the microorganisms that are living within the soil. And then those are what really are creating the nutrients and making nutrients available for the crop that we're putting in. All right, so we've added our alfalfa to the bed and watered it just a little bit in our case, since they're the pellets that'll help them expand and break down. Other types of amendments that you can use if you don't have access to, or you prefer not to use alfalfa meal or feather meal, worm castings are a phenomenal option. They're a little bit higher priced if you're doing it in bulk at a really scale level, but if you're doing it just in your home garden or something small, getting a good sized bag of worm castings and putting worm castings down first, that's a fabulous way to really add a lot of fertility to your soil. And then the next step though is where a bulk of our fertility comes from, and that's adding compost. And this is where, again, when you feel like you want to till something, think first about whether or not you can go get a whole bunch of compost and put a thick layer of compost over whatever space you're going to be growing in. And you'll be amazed to see how much the organic matter really starts to create a habitat for bug life and microorganisms to live, and fungi to start thriving. And before you know it, that soil is really going to start holding water and start softening up significantly. And so we add roughly 2 inches of compost to every bed each time that we plant in it. And so what we do is, we've got a big pile of it. We get it in bulk. We make a lot of it ourselves, but we're not quite able to supply all that we need yet with our own composting. So we get bulk orders, and then we keep kind of a stash near the gardens where we're going to be using them, and then we get them in wheelbarrows, bring them in, and then just dump the wheelbarrows on, and then rake the compost out to create a nice seed bed that's ready for planting in. And so pretty easy process. It's a little bit of just figuring out exactly how much you need as you go down the bed, dumping it on, and then we'll show you in a minute how we rake the compost out. Okay, so once we've spread our compost out, the next step is to rake it and just get it raked out into a really nice smooth shape and even, so that the bed is ready to plant into. And we use a bed prep rake that's 30 inches wide, which is exactly the width of the beds that we work on. So it makes it really handy and convenient to be able to just make one pass or a couple passes back and forth in just one rake width. You can do it with smaller rakes, and depending on your context, maybe it's something that you do with even just a small hand rake, but you're really just trying to create a nice even, moderately firm. They make bed rollers and things if you're planting something that needs a really firm seed bed, especially if you're using precision seeders that need a really smooth and firm seed bed. We don't use any of those in our context yet. We find that just being able to rake it and make a handful of passes at least, sometimes a little more, to just get that compost spread nice and evenly, that's what works for us. There's really cool tools out there too that are higher dollar tools. BCS makes a few, and the BCS walk behind tractors, where they've got like compost spreaders where you can have all the compost loaded into a bin, and it's just a tractor that you can walk right alongside, and it'll spread and rake and tamp, and then you can kind of adjust what width of bed you're working on. So depending on your context, there's different ways to accomplish this, but the good old-fashioned rake really works the best, and that's in our context and for most people, and that's what we use. So like I said, a real easy process. We're just trying to get the compost spread evenly over the bed, and we're looking for a thickness of roughly 2 inches of compost. And again, that's that idea. We're always building soil, we're adding to the soil, and in doing that, we're addressing a lot of the problems that we may have in the soil. You know, I hear people talk about my soil is too compacted, or I've just got too much rock in my soil, I can never get all the rock out. Well, think about it as building on top of the rock so that the rock kind of disappears deeper down into the soil, as opposed to trying to dig it all out. You know, these were very rocky beds when we started, but each time that we've grown them, each time we prep the bed, we're adding another layer, and those rocks are sinking deeper and deeper, and all of a sudden they're no longer rocky beds, and we haven't necessarily disturbed the soil so much by digging in and tearing out a bunch of rocks. So that's, again, think of building and adding to, as opposed to digging and turning up the soil as you're working. All right, and so here we are with our finished prepped bed. As you can see, it's nice and level, it's raked out. We do put a little bit more attention to it, making sure that it's really perfectly uniform shape, and sometimes running the back of the rake down a couple times to tamp it down if we're going to be running our seeder down it. And that's especially true if you're using a really high precision seeder. These beds need to be reasonably well compacted and very uniform. Otherwise, those seeders will start to skip or drag, and you're just going to run into a lot of problems. But in this case, we're transplanting beans in, and so the bed doesn't have to be absolutely perfectly flat or perfectly shaped. What we're really looking for is that it's got about 1.5 to 2 inches of fresh compost on top, that it's been well amended, and that it's been aerated with that broad forking, so that as we're transplanting, these plants have just an awesome environment to start growing that's nutrient rich, and they go from, you know, the starts that we have to growing immediately with very, very little transplant shock at all. And so when we're transplanting, it's real easy. As you can see, the bed's nice, loose soil, well amended, and then we're able to just take the plants, drop them in, and off we go down the bed. So that's what we'll be doing this evening. All right, thanks for following along, and we look forward to sharing more tips and tricks as the season progresses.